So today we're going to be looking at the nature of power and authority in Afghanistan. So I've just got some important notes that I want you to remember before we really begin. So as you know, Afghanistan is an androcentric society, which means basically that it's just highly patriarchal, looks at the world through a male point of view. And as we already have looked at, it's really based on tribal and kinship customs. So what this means is on the macro level, governments have always been based on a level of kinship and tribalism. So who kind of gets elected is kind of based on what families they come from, what tribes they come from. On the meso level, tribal groups control businesses, local laws, and community decisions. And this is mostly done through the zherga and mullahs. And as we know, those who become zhergas or mullahs is usually decided, again, based on that family name and that tribal group they come from. On the micro level, the patriarch controls all members of the family, as we know. So there's lots of control that stems from that androcentric based society, but also that tribal and kinship customs. So therefore, because of all of this, women have continuously struggled to hold any form of power or authority, as they don't really fit into any of these elements of the traditional structures of power and authority in Afghanistan. Okay, so we're going to go over the power structures in Afghanistan, and I know we kind of have an understanding of this already, but we're going to look at it again and go over it again, as power, as we already know, is really important for continuity and change. So kinship and land holdings are kind of the basis of power throughout Afghanistan. And this usually is stemming from a ruling elite, which are specific families that come from mostly Pashtun tribes, and they kind of stem from those rural areas but have filtered out into urban areas as well. And in one way or another, they've held positions of power in both government and like local areas and powers since the 19th centuries. And this is usually come from land-owning wealthy business families. So they're kind of the basis of that tribal power structure in Afghanistan. And they've held positions like army generals and judges. And those groups usually live in urban areas, and they tend to get educated abroad, which kind of builds their skills, knowledge, and cements that power as well. There's another group of these, and they live in the rural areas, but they arguably have considerably more power than their urban counterparts. And this is usually because power tends to be centred in these areas due to those close connections with their local community. But because they come from the same tribal areas, same family connections, there's usually a clear connection with those rural power-based families with those urban-based power families. So they tend to have that clear connection with each other. And this is something that we'll come to see in this video, but later on as well as we continue to study Afghanistan, is that the government really does rely on these tribal connections in both urban and rural areas for support. So Afghanistan, as we know, is still an agriculturally based society, with about 75% of the population living in rural agricultural areas, although again this is slowly changing, which makes up mostly landholding families, so therefore landholding is very important. And this is because landholdings give individuals the ability to be in power on a community level, partly because they have that money, but also because they have the influence. And this, as we know, kind of filters into those power structures within those rural areas, which makes up the zherga and the mullahs. And an important point to note is that zhergas and mullahs are given a lot of respect and are held in high regard. And what this means is that they can usually make decisions for their local community, especially mullahs, as they are kind of seen as those religious leaders, and so they can use religious preachings to challenge government changes or government decisions and effectively decide whether or not their community will support the changes the government has implemented. Okay, so we're going to go over the structures of power and authority on each level now. So we should be fairly familiar with the power structures on the micro level. So as we know, it's a highly patriarchal society, and this is especially the case within the family. So men are clearly at the head of the family, and they hold most of that power and authority. However, in rural areas especially, women tend to have a bit of control over domestic life, so making decisions for their children, and also making decisions, small decisions for the family. So like if there's going to be a celebration, where it should be held and how it should be done. And also something that we're going to look at a little bit more is that rural women do have some interactions with the meso world, especially through skills of carpet weaving. Especially for the poorer families, women will weave carpets that will then be sold to the market, and that they therefore contribute financially to the family as well. So as we know, traditional families tend to have 3 generations under one roof, which therefore really cements that patriarchal control, as all kind of family members are under the control of that patriarch. And as we know, family honour places great restrictions on members of the family, especially the women and youth, which therefore then just kind of ties back to that patriarchal control of family due to that family honour. And therefore children are expected to follow their fathers and to some extent their mothers, and girls especially are expected to follow that patriarch, whether they are the daughters, the wives of the sons, or the wife of the head patriarch. They're expected to follow those orders. So on the meso level, you've got 2 kind of power structures. The first one is the local government, and they are the zherga. This is only really in rural areas, and like I said before in class, I might have told you, think of them as like a council kind of based power group. So they're always comprised of local male elders. So usually the head patriarch of the important tribes in the area will make up the zherga. So they deal with disputes like the mullahs, but they deal with more, I guess, formal disputes, something like murder or property damage and things like that. They also are kind of the members that make up criminal courts, and they also have a voice in deciding directions for their local community. The other kind of meso-level power structure, well, there is the mullahs as well, but we've kind of covered that a bit, so we'll look at the other one, which is education. And at the moment, education is really a power definition tool, as not all receive it equally, and so those that do receive an education kind of get an extra boost in the power and things they're able to access over those that aren't. So in urban areas for wealthy families, education is very important. And so both boys and girls will receive an education. A lot of the time they'll be given an education overseas. So there's obviously those kind of influences of westernization, modernization that will be filtering through that, because a lot of them will be sent to places like England, America, and sometimes Australia to study. Although sometimes they may also be sent to places like Saudi Arabia, who are recognised as being a little bit more developed and wealthy than Afghanistan. For the middle to poorer classes within urban areas, families will typically just send males, as they are not able to afford to send both, because education isn't necessarily free and accessible for all at the moment in Afghanistan. Again, this creates that divide between men and women in urban areas, but it also kind of, as we've looked at, the dowry is paid for girls, and part of that dowry is based on the level of education. So this also kind of stamps out that price that women can get in poorer and middle class families, because they're not going to be as educated as their wealthy counterparts. And in rural areas, sometimes families see education as a waste of time, as they should be out working and supporting the family. And especially women, it's very rare for them to receive even basic levels of education. So urban areas, women are likely to receive at least primary school level education, whereas in rural areas it's kind of pretty much excluded from them altogether. Okay, so the last level is on the macro level. So we've really only got, again, 2 levels of power within the macro level in Afghanistan. So the first is the government, and to be honest, they held a great degree of power and authority under the Taliban, as they had significant control over over the people, and that was used through force, so militants and kind of like religious police that enforced their level of or their ideas of how the world should be and how the country should be run. But this has lessened since the Taliban have left. So they do have a degree of power, but there's clear limitations within that. The Pashtuns make up most of the seats in the Afghan government, which are mostly male. However, this is changing, especially because a quota has been introduced for women to be elected into parliament. So there's also what makes up the government is the Loya Jirga. And they're kind of like the Jirga in rural areas. However, what they are is kind of like the head tribal elders of rural areas are then selected and make up a kind of a community elected members who make national decisions. So they don't make decisions for their local community, they make national decisions for the government. So once the Taliban were ousted, the Loya Jirga came together to decide on the constitution for the new democratic government that was going to come and be formed after the Taliban were taken out. So they have considerable power in making national decisions. Any laws that are seen to be contentious that are being brought in, the Loya Jirga will come together and convene and make a decision on whether or not that law will go ahead. So yeah, and as I said, the government really relies on those local power structures, so the Jirga and also mullahs, to kind of provide them support. And anything that they kind of make a decision on, if it's not agreed upon by the mullahs or the Jirgas, it just will not be implemented in rural areas, and the government is not really seen to have any jurisdiction in those rural areas. So that's how their power is kind of limited in a way, that they have definite control in urban areas, but in rural areas it's very restricted. The other macro level power structure within Afghanistan is religion. So Islam, as we know, forms the basis of a lot of laws and daily life in Afghanistan. Mullahs, people turn to the mullahs to really guide them in their daily life. So religion is really at the core of a lot of their daily practices, as well as how they see the world, as well as how they believe that it should be run. So Sharia law is definitely a part of Afghan society. They don't follow all of Sharia laws that are in existence, but it definitely forms the basis of a lot of their legal codes and definitely how the government runs as well. So this is both on a local and national level as well. And the religion is relied upon for many decisions. So changes to dress codes, or changes to female education or women working, or changes to simple things like not simple, but I guess changes to murder codes or criminal codes. The religion is kind of used as a basis for guidance on what should be done with those decisions. Okay, so that is an outline, or I guess an overview of the power structures within Afghanistan. Like I said, this is really important to really understand continuity and change. And as we start to look at continuity and change, we're going to constantly come back to these power structures and seeing, how the variations in power and who has power can really bring about change or resist that change.